Mandarin pronunciation is not easy, so some people try to use English words to learn or teach the sounds. This is a really bad idea. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about pronunciation, and more specifically, we're going to discuss an approach to pronunciation that is very common and also very bad. The approach in question is to use English words to approximate Chinese pronunciation. So for example, you might say that the final spelled ONG in Mandarin is pronounced the same as the ending of the word long in English. Or you might say that the initial spelled with a J in Mandarin is pronounced like the J in English, so for example in the word Jeep. This approach ranges from being terrible to barely being okay, depending on what sounds you're targeting and what English words you are using. But on the whole, it is a really bad method you should stay away from. Normally, it's essential to connect what you're trying to learn to something you already know. This makes it easier to commit to memory and also easier to remember in the long term. And it also brings about understanding more easily. Learning the sounds of a foreign language is an exception though, because here your knowledge of your native language, or other languages that you speak well, might block your perception of the sounds you want to hear and learn in Mandarin. So essentially, if you think of Pinyin J as being the same as English J, this will block you from hearing the difference because these sounds are actually not the same. They are not pronounced in the same part of the mouth, and they're also pronounced in a different manner. But if you learned J by thinking that it's like J in English, this will be harder to perceive. For more about learning how to hear the sounds and tones in Mandarin, there is a separate episode about that, so please check out episode 198 for that, and as usual I'll put links to these articles and episodes in the show notes. Learning to hear the sounds and tones of Mandarin as an adult is not easy. It is one of the things that definitely become harder when you're an adult compared to when you're a child. Children typically master the phonology of languages that they are immersed in and engage with as they grow up, without studying or focusing on this in particular. But this is almost never the case when studying a foreign language as an adult. Part of the reason for this is that we as adults already have sound systems firmly embedded into our brains, and we tend to sort what we hear based on these systems rather than the new system we are trying to learn. This doesn't mean that it's impossible to learn Mandarin pronunciation as an adult, but it means that it's certainly one of the more difficult things to do fully and well. But for more information, check that article and episode I just mentioned. In this episode, we're talking about something that can make learning pronunciation much harder, namely how you write it down and how you refer to these sounds in writing, namely by using English words. I'm not trying to say that if you stop doing this, it will suddenly be easy to perceive Mandarin sounds, but there is no reason to make it harder than it already is. So the fundamental problem with using English words to approximate sounds in Mandarin is that it's almost always wrong. So saying that something in Mandarin is pronounced like something else in English is only correct in a very small number of cases. The only situation where I think it makes sense to use English words to teach Mandarin pronunciation is if the student is not really interested in learning the sound system properly. For example, if a teacher asks me how to pronounce a pupil's name, and this name is in Chinese then, this teacher is not interested in mastering Chinese pronunciation long term, they just want to get this person's name roughly right. Another example might be a phrasebook for people who go to China and haven't studied any Chinese and don't plan to do so. Some quick tips in English here will help you to get the sounds roughly right so that people stand a chance of understanding you. However, I assume that you as a listener are actually learning Chinese, and that means that your long-term goal is some kind of mastery of the sound system. If this means clear and understandable Mandarin, although with a foreign accent, or native-like pronunciation, doesn't really matter. Using English words is bad anyway. It's true that your goal here does matter a little bit. For example, there are some sounds that are close enough, and if you just use the English version, you will be understood, but you don't sound native-like. For example, if we use the vowel sound in the English word shoe to approximate the pronunciation of the final in Pinyin spelled with a U, so for example in the word book, shu, people will understand what you mean, and there is very little risk of misunderstanding you, but it immediately gives you away as a foreigner who speaks English. Then there are more serious cases where people will really misunderstand what you say. So it's very common for beginners who rely a lot on Pinyin and also speak English to pronounce words like shi, to be, as she, which is so wrong that it can be hard to understand. The problem here is, of course, that the sound we're after in Mandarin doesn't exist in English, and there is no close approximation, and if you try to make one, the result will be bad. Another common example is the vowel U in Mandarin, which is spelled with a U with 2 dots over it most of the time, which doesn't have a corresponding vowel in English, so anything you say will be wrong. I've seen people try to describe this in many ways, for example by saying that the difference between U with dots on it in pinyin and the U without dots is like the difference between feud and food. But this is of course wrong. The vowel sounds in feud is U, and the sound in Mandarin is U, and these are clearly not the same. The other one, the food, is better. It's the same as the shoe I mentioned earlier. It's not terrible, but it's not entirely accurate either. So the problem here is that saying things like pinyin Q is pronounced like the CH in cheat, or maybe that IU in Mandarin is pronounced like EO, or that C is pronounced like the TS in cats, or what have you, is that while this is very tempting and seems to give you a guide to how Mandarin is pronounced that is easy to access, it's also always wrong. There is a very small number of sounds such as M, N, S, F and L, which are pronounced very similar in the languages, or you could argue that depending on how you speak them that they are identical, but basically anything else that you use English to describe will be wrong. If you want a full guide to pinyin traps and pitfalls, so specific cases in pinyin that people tend to get wrong, you can check out episode 76, and I'll put a link in the show notes of course as well. Writing down speech sounds is notoriously difficult, and we do have a scientific framework for doing this properly called the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA for short. This is also what I use in combination with pinyin in my pronunciation course to make sure that you learn the right sounds and not just something that sounds roughly like the right sounds to people who have never studied Mandarin. The major advantage with IPA is that it has one symbol for one sound, so there's a one-to-one correspondence there, compared to pinyin, which certainly isn't like that. So for example, we have some sounds in Mandarin that are written with the same letter, even though they are pronounced differently. And the U we talked about earlier might be an example, where sometimes these dots are not visible in the spelling, and so you can't just look at the letter and know how it is pronounced. We also have the opposite case, where we have several different ways of spelling something that is actually pronounced the same way. Now, the solution is not for everybody to always learn IPA and stick to that. I think that's highly unrealistic, and there are downsides to doing that as well, but rather that you should study the spoken language directly. You should listen attentively, you should mimic, you should compare. These do not rely on any kind of written symbols, and so you can go directly to what matters, the actual sounds and tones of Mandarin. For more about this, you should check out a free lesson from my pronunciation course available on YouTube and on the podcast, which focuses on mimicking native speakers, so why you should do it and how. And on the podcast, this is episode 162. Anyway, using English words is really bad, and it's bad for more reasons than those we've mentioned so far. Another problem is that speakers of English pronounce things differently. This is particularly true for vowels, but can sometimes be true for consonants as well. For example, I talked briefly about the Mandarin final O and G earlier, which might or might not be pronounced as the word long in English. When I speak English, I pronounce this word with an O sound, so long, long, which is fairly close to long in Chinese, and I should mention here there is some variation. Some people in Mandarin will say long with an U sound, and others will say long with a more O sound, pretty similar to what I say in English. There are many speakers of English, in the US for example, that pronounces this with a much more open vowel, more like long. And this sound is pretty far away from the Mandarin target. If you say dong to understand in Mandarin with the long sound I have in English, which is what I just tried to do, this is perfectly understandable. But if you start saying dang, this is pretty hard to understand, and it gets dangerously close to what's spelled with an A in Mandarin, so dang. Anyway, the point here is that when anybody says anything about how something is pronounced in Mandarin using English words, you actually have no clue what they are referring to, especially not when it comes to vowels. And remember, the reason I'm talking about this is that this is not just a stepping stone you can use as a transition from knowing nothing to getting better at Mandarin pronunciation. Using English words to approximate pronunciation in Mandarin will stop you from perceiving the sounds and make it much harder to reach your goal. It is not essentially a stepping stone, it's more like a trap or a pitfall. There is a fair amount of research showing that orthography, so how we spell things and how words are spelt and written down, actually does influence pronunciation quite a lot, even for native speakers, but this is a little bit out of scope here, but it's something I hope to return to later. I would also like to repeat my earlier point. Mandarin pronunciation can be hard beyond what I'm talking about here. I'm not saying that if you stop using English words, it will suddenly become super easy, but at least you're not making it harder for yourself. To really hammer home how bad it is to use words in one language to learn the pronunciation of another, let's look at the opposite case for a bit. So using Chinese pronunciation to teach English pronunciation. This is actually quite common and might sometimes be okay. As I mentioned earlier, in a phrasebook meant for people who are not studying the language, using your native language to approximate sounds in a foreign language can be okay. I have several books that do this, so they are books for Chinese tourists who can't pronounce English, and they then use Chinese characters to help them with this. So a bit tongue-in-cheek and for fun, let's see if you can guess what these words mean. So I'm going to read them based on the Chinese characters, and you should then guess which English words you think hide behind these pronunciations. Number 1, 古德猫宁. Number 2, 三客游. Number 3, 死状. Number 4, 该死. Number 5, 拽死. Number 6, 噎死. Number 7, 俺不能死. Number 8, 奈特. Number 9, 汉字. Number 10, banana. And number 11, 内母. So I'll go through them again now with the correct answers, and you can see how many you got right. First out, we had 古德猫宁, which is good morning. Then 三客游, which means thank you. Then we had 死状, which means strong. And 该死 for guess. And then 拽死 for dress. Then 噎死 for yes. And 不能死 for ambulance. 奈特 for night. 汉字 for hands. And banana for banana. And finally 内母 for name. So what did you think? Were these easy to guess? Were they good examples of English pronunciation? I'm sure you were able to guess some of them. I mean, not all of them are terrible, but some are rather far away from the intended target. Before we leave using Chinese characters to pronounce English words, I want to mention an interesting effect here on pronunciation. So one of the examples here was 拽死 for dress. So here we have the initial ZH in Mandarin, standing in for the consonant cluster DR in English. This consonant cluster is very hard to pronounce for most native speakers of Mandarin, because we don't have consonant clusters in Mandarin, so people try to do all kinds of things to get away from that. Sometimes people insert a little in between, so they might say things like deres, or perhaps student to avoid the ST in student. Another option then is to use ZH instead of DR, so when you pronounce a word like dry in English, you actually cheat a little bit and use the initial ZH instead, so you're actually saying the Mandarin syllable ZHUAI instead of the English word DRY. So instead of dry, you're saying dry. And if you say this quickly inside of a sentence, it is acoustically very similar to the English pronunciation, but as I think you can agree, it is a different sound and produced completely differently. Yet I have asked many Chinese native speakers of this, and it's not uncommon that they actually pronounce this word in English with the same tongue position as the initial in Chinese. So this is just one small example of how sounds in your native language can block you from both perceiving and pronouncing the sounds of a new language. So the conclusion is that you shouldn't use English words to approximate the sounds in Mandarin. This is a very bad idea, and it will stop you from perceiving the words and pronouncing them properly. Asking a question like how is Q pronounced and then expecting an answer written in English is bound to create confusion and have bad effects. In a very few number of cases, the approximations might be okay, but in most cases they are not. The solution is not necessarily to learn IPA and see how phoneticians write sounds down, but it is instead to mostly focus on the spoken language directly through listening and mimicking. You can of course also talk about pronunciation without approximating pronunciation. I often use non-scientific words to do this, and it works perfectly fine. I can say that the difference between Q and J in pinyin is that the Q has a puff of air and that the J does not. I do not need to say that this is called aspiration in phonetics. Still, learning some theory is important because it can help direct your attention to the sounds you might not be able to hear. So don't use English words to approximate pronunciation, listen more than you read, mimic as much as you can, and your Mandarin pronunciation will be much the better for it. This is not as quick or as easy as relying on your knowledge of English pronunciation, but the end result will be so much better. If you want a complete description of all the sounds and tones in Mandarin, you can check out my video course, Hacking Chinese Pronunciation, Speaking with Confidence. And naturally, in the course, I do not rely on English words to describe Mandarin pronunciation, but rather show you how they are pronounced, both using graphs and images, as well as talking about the sounds and describing them that way, but of course, most importantly, by saying them so you can hear and mimic. For more about my courses, check out hackingchinese.com/courses. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.